Well, it's my pleasure to be back, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to a guest that we're going to learn from over the next 25 minutes. His name is Ian Bremmer. Ian is the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, what is today the world's largest political risk intelligence and assessment service. It's a firm that works around the world. Ian is not just a noted political scientist. He travels the world himself. He spends time with head of states. I suspect you've seen him on television or the internet or in social media. Please join me in welcoming Ian Bremmer. Thank you. Well, Ian, thank you for being here. It's a great opportunity for you to share your insights and for all of us to learn from your travels around the world. I was obviously on stage just a little while ago talking about 2017, which has been a rather unusual year. What do you think history will remember 2017 as being the most memorable?
Well, from my perspective as a political scientist, it's a little more concerning than the Microsoft and the technology perspective where so many great things are happening. And the biggest has to be the unwind between Americanization and globalization. Right? We've been living in a world where those two things for the past couple generations have been pretty much aligned. They aren't anymore. 2017 won't be remembered as the year that the United States falls into decline. It won't be remembered as the year where the US is no longer the superpower. We still are, and no one else is close. But it will be the year where the idea of US-led global environment is no longer with us. And it won't be replaced by anything else. And unless you think that's Ian saying it's because of Trump, it's because of a lot of things. It's the rise of China, it's the weakening of the transatlantic relationship, it's the Brexit referendum, it's the Middle East imploding and fragmenting, it's Russia undermining a US-led order. But all of that, of course, then coming with America First, where the United States says we don't want to be the global policeman, we don't want to be the architect of global trade, and perhaps most crucially, we're no longer prepared to try to be the cheerleader for global values. And I think when you put those things together, 2017 is the year that we close the chapter on a US-led global order that we've basically lived with since 1945.
There's also been, in addition to this retreat from global leadership aspirations, sort of waves of populism around the world over the last couple of years. What do you make of that? Has it crested? Is it going to continue to spread? What should we expect for the future?
Populism, as we've seen it, is not yet a global phenomenon. It's primarily pockets of the developed world, United States and Europe. The good news is even there, it's not everywhere. You look at Japan, which in many ways has functioned as a single-party democracy. Their population is shrinking, which means not a lot of growth, but per capita, working class and middle class in Japan feels pretty good. Furthermore, no immigration, which means they haven't had trouble with immigration, the populist backlash you've seen in other places. In Germany, they have a big immigration issue that has caused populism, but the economy, they feel very comfortable and even very optimistic about it. The election's coming up in just a few months. Merkel looks like she's a slam dunk, if I can say that, at the Verizon Center. There's got to be at least one basketball analogy. I'll try to work in a hockey one. But for the rest, for the United States and the rest of Europe, this is growing. And I would say the US elections, the French elections, and the British elections and the referendum, even though the outcomes were different, were all about the same thing. They were all surprisingly large parts of the population saying the social contract doesn't work, saying the establishment political leaders, the CEOs, the bankers, the mainstream media, the public intellectuals do not represent me. And so either I want outcomes that are completely different and I'm gonna vote for them, or I'm not gonna vote at all. And in the United States, most important election of any of our lifetimes, you had surprisingly few people bother to vote. And of those that voted, you had a lot of people saying Bernie Sanders. You had a lot of people saying Donald Trump. Very much outside the tradition of the US political spectrum. In the UK, same thing with the Brexit referendum, which was not so much a we want Brexit, it's a we don't trust what you're telling us. And going after Theresa May just last month as well. In France, yes, Macron won, but he won by creating a new party, by throwing out his Minister of Economy role with President Hollande. And of course, you also had double the outcome for the National Front Party that you'd ever seen historically. And looking forward, there's no reason to believe that these problems are going to be addressed by voting through the same solutions that these people have been. And so as a consequence, I do think that this level of populism is not only with us, but is likely to expand, and it's gonna come much more quickly than a lot of the longer-term challenges that we've been learning about for decades now, say global climate.
When you think about that spread of populism, when you think about the rejection of sort of this current social compact, if you will, what do you think that means for technology and for all of us who work in the tech sector?
Well, one thing it means is if the central government isn't getting it done for the people, people are going to look to other organizations to make life work. So for me, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is running to be president of the United States by going to all 50 states. I think he's running to be virtual emperor, right? In the sense that he understands that people are spending an extraordinary amount of time with, his parameters, and he wants to provide for them solutions. And I think that looking for technology companies around the world, their ability to say, I'm part of your solution, and the government is failing you, I'm gonna step up. I'll step up as a partner for that government, or I'll step up directly, a partner with a local government. I'm servicing you as a consumer, whatever it is, but you're going to have much more responsibility. The stewardship increasingly is not just to the shareholders. It's not just to the consumers and to the products you can provide them, but it's what are you doing as a big, wealthy organization that is making my life better as my government doesn't make it work? So that's one big piece. The other big piece, of course, is that technology is increasingly becoming not a, but the strategic sector. So 30 years ago, if you were a company like Lockheed Martin, you knew that you weren't like Coca-Cola. You couldn't be in every country. You could have great fighter jets, and if the Russians or if the Soviets wanted to buy them, I don't care, because they're no friends of the Americans, right? But if you were a company like Microsoft, you just want to get everyone connected. And I think that in a world where cybersecurity is increasingly a grave threat, in a world where the control of big data and of the transmission mechanisms means that I want to be between the consumer and everything they do and experience and all the ways they spend money, that becomes a very strategic place to be. The Chinese government understands that. The American government increasingly understands that too. So as for a company like Microsoft or anyone in the tech sector, understanding how governments are your partners or your antagonists and what that means for how you develop yourself becomes as important as your consumer base.
As some national governments have stepped back, as there's an opportunity or even need for others to step forward, we're obviously seeing this not just in the tech sector, we're seeing it here in the United States at the municipal level. We're seeing cities, we're seeing states play a bigger role. We're seeing this in some other countries as well. Do you think that's a good or a bad thing overall?
It's a bad thing Because if the national government doesn't provide infrastructure and the local municipalities and the states do, you're going to see greater inequality. Because those that have the money, those that can do the public-private partnerships end up with great solutions. Those that can't really fall aside. Cities do much better in that environment, especially first-tier cities. So effectively, you're servicing an archipelago and not a great nation or not a global connected world. But the good news is that in the United States, if Washington is broken, fracking and the energy revolution for the whole world happened not because of the White House. It happened because of what happened in individual state governments, because they wanted the jobs and they wanted the money. You're going to see that all over the world, too.
Interesting. And you talked a little bit about the role of the tech sector and technology to sort of help fill this void, to play a bit of a centralizing function, if you will. But at the same time, there's obviously questions in many people's minds about where technology is going. Is it going to do the world good? Is it not? AI in particular has become a big topic. What's it going to do for jobs? As you talk to government leaders around the world, what do you hear them thinking about when it comes to something like the future of AI and its impact on people's jobs?
Not enough.
Interesting.
Not realizing the urgency. I mean, look, in the United States, we've had 6 months of our hair on fire because we love Trump or we hate Trump. That's not an environment where we're spending a lot of time thinking about the future of AI and work. I think in China, with a big leadership transition coming up and with desires to maintain 6.5% growth straight through 2020, that's not an environment. Yeah, they're building industrial robots. They're thinking strategically, but are they really thinking how are we going to lose jobs with AI? No. And I think that this last wave of globalization was one where labor moved from the US and Europe and Japan to emerging markets. We created global supply chains. They were cheaper, they were efficient, and we could move that everywhere. The next wave of globalization, of automation, of robotics, of big data, of AI, is all about labor being disintermediated from capital. And that means that a lot of those jobs aren't there. And even if AI creates lots of new jobs, it's very clear that to get from here to there, there's a real big dip. And a lot of the people that you want to get there, that are here, they ain't making it through that dip. So if the governments aren't able to respond, you've got a big problem. And I think there are models out there. Singapore is a great model, right? Because they want to connect everyone, they want to have lifetime learning, they want to really be on the cutting edge on digital, they want to have the best education, they want to have the best healthcare. Awesome. But there is another model. Israel-Palestine is a model. Israel and the Middle East has the best education and governance, rule of law, any country in the Middle East, as long as you're not Palestinian in the occupied territories. And let us not pretend that that's not a stable governance environment in the Middle East today. Most of the Middle East is much less stable than Israel-Palestine. And I think it's important to understand that around the world, governments that are not capable or not willing to move towards Singapore as a model will move towards Israel-Palestine. And there are implications for that.
Wow.
And thank you for the Israeli and Palestinian delegations there. I appreciate that.
You made an interesting comment a minute ago. You basically said, in the United States and some other places, it's as if our hair is on fire.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have a thoughtful conversation on anything when your hair is on fire. That was your basic point. When you think about these issues of technology, globalization, economic change, we'll be able to look to Singapore, but what are the big countries where we'll see a more thoughtful conversation emerge? Are there some places where you're more optimistic about the opportunity to have a more thoughtful conversation?
Yes, but I'm not sure they're big countries. They're pieces of big countries. This is why I mentioned the archipelago, right? I mean, companies have been thinking we're going to go global, and that means we're going to hit all of these different consumers. But if we're moving towards an archipelago, going global may only mean touching the top 50 million people around the world. That's where you get most of your benefit. That's a different kind of world. Those conversations are happening in the United States, but they're not happening across the nation, right? I mean, when the United States pulled out of the Paris Accord, joining Syria and Nicaragua, and that's it, there were a lot of people in the US that said, no, we're going to stick with that. Those are intelligent conversations. And there are intelligent conversations about the future of work in this country. There are intelligent conversations about how to partner with universities and offer, possibilities for workforces that will be fundamentally different in 5 and 10 years than they are today. But if you ask me, can Washington have that conversation? No. Can China have that conversation? Given the level of centralization of that government today and what their priorities are? No. Can Russia? Are you kidding me?
What about Berlin?
Berlin's the right question, because if there were a leader of the free world today, it would be Germany. It would be Merkel. There isn't one. But if there was one, it would be Germany. But I think they're aware of it. Because the reason why the Merkel-Trump relationship is so comparatively toxic to those of the US president with other traditional American allies is because the German relationship relies the most on shared institutions and standards and values and rule of law. And Merkel and the German entire political leadership are unnerved by that. So yes, they are doing an awful lot of thinking of what they should do to continue to ensure that these institutions, that the global architecture that we've lived with and flourished under continues to be sustainable. But then I look at the realities of what Germany has to deal with over the next few years in terms of the relationships inside a Europe which is facing an existential question of what Europe is going to look like, the most important experiment in supranational governance that the world has ever seen, and is fundamentally failing. The Germans are the ones that are most trying to address that, and it is going to occupy so much of their political bandwidth, not to mention years of Brexit negotiations. So I would say the Germans are a good place to go to have these conversations, but will the Germans be global leaders? No. Modi in India, a great place to go to have this conversation, but will the Indians be the global leaders? The Indians have about 1.3 billion people, and New Zealand has 4 million. Those two countries have the same number of diplomats.
Really?
Right? And nobody asked New Zealand to get anything done, right? But India, because they've got 1.3 billion people, we're like, India can be a part of the solution. There are a lot of Indian entrepreneurs that can be a part of the solution, but the bandwidth constraints of the Indian government to actually do global stuff are immense,
You mentioned Paris, and obviously the Paris Accord has been a big issue. It was an issue where people were optimistic a year ago, and the news has not been so optimistic this year. Let me ask you a couple of questions about it.
Well, first of all, who was optimistic about the Paris Accord a year ago?
Well, at least people were optimistic that it was done. The world had come together. Everybody except the Syrians and the Nicaraguans, that felt like the world was coming together. Not so much this year. One of the things that it's interesting as an American company, is we find that people elsewhere in the world they're looking at the United States a little differently in 2017. They're certainly looking at the US government a little differently for the reasons that you mentioned at the outset. Not wanting to lead the world anymore. When people look at the United States from other countries, how much do they think about the government? How much do they think about the population? How much do they think about the business community? How much do they disaggregate this into different pieces that might have different points of views on issues like the Paris Accord?
If you go to a place, you go to sub-Saharan Africa, you go to Nigeria, you go to South Africa, and attitudes towards the United States are still extraordinarily strong. And I think that has as much to do with Bill Gates as it does with any American president. I think it has as much to do with the fact that they see our universities and our corporations and our entrepreneurs as aspirational, and they want to be a part of that, and they still see America as a success story, a place they want to get to, a place they want to work. But I think there are other countries in the world that saw the United States as the shining light, as the beacon. Angela Merkel says we'll take whatever refugees we can, doesn't get supported for it in Germany, right? When Syria's falling apart, wir schaffen das. We can do this. 1 million people. She turns to the US. Obama. The US was there when the wall came down. We brought the wall down, but now that walls are coming up all over Europe, Merkel thought the US was going to get it done. And you know what Obama said? No, thank you. That wasn't Trump. That was Obama. And I think it's important to recognize that the United States turning away from global leadership is something that did not start with the inauguration in January. It's something that we saw with over 3 million Americans fighting in failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, coming back, not being treated as heroes, not knowing why they did it. And those young men and women and all of their families and their communities around them are asking themselves, why are we doing this? Why is America playing this role? And I think that a lot of people in inner cities and in rural areas in the United States who used to believe in the American dream and don't anymore, because NAFTA may have helped the shareholders, may have helped the United States from a macro perspective, but didn't help them. And so I think that that's been coming for decades. We're now seeing the outcomes of it. Obama's had to contend with that. Hillary, running for president, had to jettison the Trans-Pacific Partnership that she was one of the architects of, had to deal with that. And Trump became president on the back of that. And around the world, countries are looking at America and at Americans, and they're saying that role of being the beacon, of leading by example, the American dream is not something we really believe in as much anymore. Final point. There is one country in the world today of size with a global economic strategy. One country. It's not the US. It's China. And when Trump made his first trip internationally to Saudi Arabia and the Orb and Israel and Europe, the most important thing happening in the world didn't involve the US president. It was the first ever One Belt, One Road summit held in Beijing with 29 heads of state from all over the world coming to China. And it's because the Chinese are writing big checks and they're thinking economically around the world, kind of like the US did when the US promoted the Marshall Plan. Difference is, when the Americans promoted the Marshall Plan, they wanted rule of law and liberal democracy. The Chinese are not promoting rule of law and liberal democracy. So we can now see the future of a new economy where there will no longer be a global free market. The future of the global economy will be a hybrid economy. The largest economy that's spending big money outside is going to be a state capitalist economy. The Americans will still be primarily a free market economy. And in between, countries are going to hedge and align and think differently. And so your question asking me of how people around the world are thinking about the United States, increasingly in 5 years, you won't ask me that question. You'll ask me, how do they think about China? How do they think about the US? And how do they think about some other things?
Right.
That's a really different lens. And Microsoft is going to get that.
Obviously, economics matter enormously. And we also live in a time when national security matters. Yeah, it's interesting because we've all, as an industry, had to navigate quite a situation over the last 4 years, since 2013. That's when Ed Snowden flew to Hong Kong with his laptops and started to publish documents. And we've had a bit of a roller coaster. There have been parts of this roller coaster where every day there's been a heightened focus on privacy and government surveillance. And yet there are other days when the world is reacting to the latest terrorist incident. Where is the pendulum now? And where do you see it going in this, say, tension between privacy and surveillance to fight terrorism?
I mean, there's no question that those tensions are always going to exist. And yet you do see privacy eroding simply by virtue of the tools that are available on a daily basis, right? If we can collect all that data, someone's going to collect the data, whether it's corporations or whether it's governments. If it's China, it's primarily the government. If it's the United States, it's primarily corporations. Some countries, it'll be more centralized. Some, it'll be more competitive. But nonetheless, overwhelmingly, we're moving towards there ain't no privacy. And there are lots of, and I think generationally, younger people around the world are coming to terms with what that means for the way they live their lives. And values and norms and what isn't acceptable about what we learn about our friends and colleagues is going to change as well. The national security aspect is on technology is definitely making a greater fragmentation of the global economy. I mean, if you are China and you are fundamentally more concerned about the political sustainability of your system than economic growth, yes, economic growth facilitates that. But when there is a choice, you know where you come down. That, as they become more powerful, that obviously means that the national security lens is going to become greater. As cyber concerns become greater, if I look at countries like Iran and North Korea, we have argued about their national security threat in this country, in Europe, and around the world primarily through an old lens. Nuclear proliferation, ICBMs. It's like after the 9/11 attacks, we made damn sure that you were not going to get on a plane with a box cutter. I'm not sure that was the best use of all of that money. And in Iran and North Korea, I'm much more worried about the threat that they represent from a cyber perspective than I am from a conventional nuclear perspective. I mean, when Iran reverse engineered Stuxnet and other viruses and created Shamoon and went after Saudi Arabia, that's much more concerning than anything that they had done through, for example, even Hezbollah and their support there. When North Korea goes after the central bank of Bangladesh and almost steals $1 billion, you say, wait, this is a problem. ISIS, grabbing over $100 million recently by basically creating false websites for Al Jazeera, other organizations, but with real advertising. And the intelligence community didn't know they were doing it for over a year. That clearly means that the national security installations in these countries are playing catch up. And if they think that the private sector is a place where they can squeeze in order to make themselves look better, or toward a scapegoat in some countries, they're going to do that. And the big question is, what kind of tools does the government have? Is it a sledgehammer or a scalpel? When the Arab Spring started, the Egyptian government saw that there was a threat. All they had was a sledgehammer, so they shut down the internet. The Syrians had help from the Russians. They saw a threat. They actually went in. They said, who are the people that are causing problems? Let's find them. Let's imprison them. Let's squeeze them. Let's follow them. And suddenly, all the moderates, or the would-be moderates, that the West is trying to work with in Syria don't exist anymore. I think that all governments will react in ways to ensure that national security is controlled by them, but they have vastly different tools to use it. Those places that have scalpels will be much more attractive for the private sector than those that have sledgehammers.
A lot of your fundamental message here is that the world's more fragmented. People have to pay attention to more countries, not just one or two or three. And what's interesting is we have here companies literally from around the world. I know people come to this conference and they make connections with other companies on literally a global, very multilateral basis. Out of these kinds of connections, they may find additional opportunities to partner with each other. Some might even find themselves investing in each other in the future. what advice would you have for them as they think about their potential business strategies in a global way?
Well, I don't think that globalization is going away. I think that people are moving across borders, and money is moving across borders, and data is moving across borders faster and faster. The point is that that globalization process is not happening in a way that's being driven by one country anymore. It's being driven by lots of different countries, and if you pick one, you might not be able to pick another. So I think the first thing, everyone is a potential partner in this world. Sanctions are going to erode. Values will become more lower common denominators. So people are going to be thinking much more globally in terms of their range of options. But I think you have to be much more strategic in thinking, if I'm picking A, option A, what implications did that have in a cascading way for all of these other countries and partners all over the world, in terms of the public sectors, but also in terms of the governments, because the sector's more strategic. So again, you think about China, a lot of companies would say, I'm going to do China or not do China, and that decision will have very little to do to anywhere else around the world. Well, in an environment where China is the largest trade partner for more countries than the US is, and where China is absolutely dominant in many Asian economies, African economies, a lot of those economies will start orienting towards Chinese standards. Some of those countries will be hedging between the US and China. Effectively, some not. Some countries in Asia will become more US-oriented because China will be seen as more competitive. I certainly see this as emerging in a big way under Modi's India. I see this in a big way with Abe in Japan under siege, but wanting to ensure he changes his constitution and gets more of a security focus before he leaves. That's why the first trip to see President Trump, it wasn't Canada, it wasn't Mexico, it was Abe getting on a plane and going to New York before the inauguration. So as you're thinking about global partners, you're always going to be thinking, where's my business? You're always going to think, who's a trusted partner? Who has the management capabilities? What do the commercial aspects look like? But increasingly, you're also going to think, this is a strategic sector, this is a strategic play. How does this partner, how does this customer set align me or not align me with governments and their consumer base all over the world? And that's going to happen country by country. It's also, as we see a move where central governments don't work as effectively, it's going to happen city by city. I was in Singapore recently, and I saw the Prime Minister, whose relationship with President Trump is not awesome, right? But whose relationship with American mayors and governors has never been better. Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada announced last week he will be, for the first time of any Canadian Prime Minister, coming to address the National Governors Association in the United States. We can't use a country lens as much anymore. We're going to have to say who these partners are going to be. And in the same way that you're going to have, if someone becomes a close ally of a key competitor of yours in the private sector, they may be verboten. That's increasingly going to be true with an entire shifting landscape of national and subnational and local governmental actors. It's an entirely new environment, but the people that get it right first are going to have massive first mover advantage. Because an economy that's controlled by a government, whether national or local, if you're out, you're really out. But if you're local and you're in, you're kind of a monopoly. And that's a license to print money for a while, which, as we've seen in the tech sector in the United States, first mover advantage is massive. Don't forget about that with your government partners globally.
Let me ask you one last question. Amidst this sort of fragmented world, local governments, sometimes national governments pulling back, there is one issue that almost inherently will always unite the planet, and that is the set of issues around climate and sustainability. The audience here this morning, we started this morning, in effect, by seeing images relating to that. Especially at a time when there are governments pulling back, there's these pulling and pushing between nations. What does that mean for us in the tech sector? What do you see as our role, our responsibility, or our opportunity to address issues relating to climate and sustainability?
Different parts of the world see climate completely differently. I mean, I push back when you talked about the success of Paris, because of course the success of Paris came after the failure of Copenhagen, the failure of Durban, the failure of Cancun. And I don't think anyone that spend their careers looking at climate and what we are doing to our species and the various species that exist on this planet, what we're doing to forced migrations, what we're doing to the sustainability of this incredible gift we've been given, can say that Paris was a success. It was too little, it was too late, and we're now looking at a world where it's not about trying to address climate change, it's about trying to adapt to climate change and understand who the winners and losers are going to be. We're not going to tell the Maldives that we're going to fix your country. We're going to get it right. We're going to tell the Maldives, we're sorry, we screwed up. We're going to have to move you and help you find a new country. We'll have more of those conversations. Now, what was great about Paris is that Obama and Xi Jinping saw that despite all of the problems, despite the extraordinary difference in perspective, we had to create some incremental movement, and that furthermore, you had people like Mike Bloomberg and Bill Gates and Jack Ma and mayors from cities across India and China who can't breathe their air anymore saying, we've got to do something. And that's why you got something done in Paris. And the fact that Trump went to the world and said, we're out, and the rest of the world at the G20 said, you know what, we're still in, and the CEOs and the governors and the mayors said, we're still in, tells you that this is still going to move. And the role that corporations are going to play is going to be immense. It's much bigger than it would have been before. You know, the good news, there's a great book that came out recently, Tyler Cohen, The Complacent Class, about how in the United States there's a whole bunch of people that don't feel urgency. When we don't feel urgency, we don't move. Climate's finally getting to the point that people are starting to feel urgency, and Trump pulling out of the Paris deal have made others around the world, Americans and everyone represented here in this stadium, made us think, you know what, maybe we need to start doing more of this ourselves. Americans... Far be it from me to run over that sort of thing. So Americans do not respond well to life as usual. Human beings don't. We need adversity in order to show us our best. And the beautiful thing, I mean, the two of us are not speaking on the global stage here. They took that away. We're speaking on a stage that's divided here. And we're here on ground zero. And I have to say that the thing that makes me most optimistic about the future of our planet is that I know that we will all show our best when we're pushed, when we're forced to. I'm not going to give a great speech when I'm in front of 5 people that aren't paying attention. I'm going to try to do my best when I'm in front of all of you, right? And you are too. And the planet is going to demand a lot more of us over the coming years in this challenging geopolitical environment. And all of us have something to say to the planet, which is that we're up for it.
Well, I think that's a good place to close. A sense of urgency at ground zero. Ian Bremmer, thank you.